What would you do if your own daughter and her husband tried to steal everything you had and throw you away like yesterday's trash? That's not a movie line, it's my life, my family betrayal story. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 69 years old, and for most of my life, I believed love and sacrifice would always be enough to hold a family together. I was wrong. I live alone now in the same two-story suburban home where my late husband Edward and I built decades of memories. The walls still whisper his voice. The garden still carries his touch. Every morning I wake up and reach for my chipped coffee mug, the one he bought me at a flea market 30 years ago. I sit by the kitchen window surrounded by blooming African violets, sipping my coffee, pretending for a moment that nothing has changed. But deep inside, I feel the silence growing heavier, pressing against me like an invisible weight. On the outside, my life may look quiet, even peaceful. But if you stay with me, you'll uncover the truth, a truth darker than any courtroom drama you've ever binged on Netflix. This isn't just a tale of aging or loneliness. This is about elder betrayal, about a toxic son-in-law who smiled to my face while plotting my destruction, and about a daughter I once cradled in my arms, who turned her back when I needed her most. I want you to imagine this with me. The living room, where I still keep Edward's leather chair, worn down at the arms. The family photographs on the wall from birthdays to graduations. The faint smell of apple pie that seems forever baked into the kitchen wood. Every corner of this house is a piece of me, a piece of us. And yet to them, it's just square footage, dollar signs, a property to be taken. When I was young, I thought betrayal came from strangers, enemies, or rivals. Never in my wildest nightmares did I expect it to come from the very people I gave my life for. That's what makes this story so haunting, so dangerous, and why I need you to listen closely, because what happened to me could happen to anyone, your neighbor, your friend, your own family. This isn't just my fight for survival. It's about dignity, justice, and the shocking discovery of a hidden inheritance that would change everything. Before this story ends, you'll see how far greed can go, how deep wounds can cut, and how justice can sometimes rise from the most unexpected places. So lean in, don't click away. Because this isn't just another revenge story. This is a warning, a confession, and a promise, all at once. My name is Helen Carter, and this is how my own family tried to erase me only to unleash the fight of my life. The betrayal began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow leak in the foundation of Helen's life. For 72 years, she had lived in the modest but warm house that had become an extension of herself. Its creaking wooden floors carried the echoes of her children's footsteps. Its kitchen smelled of the countless meals she had prepared, and the garden out back bloomed with flowers that had been her refuge in the loneliest moments of widowhood. This house was more than shelter. It was her history, her independence, and the last tangible link to her late husband. Yet to Sophia, her eldest daughter and Mark Sophia's calculating husband, it was nothing more than an asset to be stripped, sold, and converted into profit. Their betrayal was not sudden. It was orchestrated with the precision of a con. They cloaked their intentions in the language of care and responsibility. But beneath those words lay hunger for ownership. At first, Helen noticed small shifts in tone. Sophia began visiting less as a daughter and more as a supervisor, scanning the house as though evaluating property rather than visiting a mother. Mark, with his smug half-smile, often asked about the upkeep costs, the property taxes, the repairs that an old woman should not have to worry about. They would gently plant seeds in her mind. Wouldn't it be easier if you didn't have to manage all this space? Or, Mom, you should think about a place where people could look after you every day. At first, Helen dismissed it. She was still healthy, still capable of cooking her meals, tending her garden, and taking her daily walks. But as the weeks passed, the conversations grew more pointed, more manipulative. Sophia began to frame it as a moral duty. We just want the best for you, Mom. While Mark spoke in terms of safety. What if you fall one night and no one finds you? Their words dripping with false concern began to erode Helen's confidence. The decisive blow came when Helen discovered that Sophia and Mark had already contacted a nursing home without her consent. They arrived one morning with paperwork and a forced air of cheer, insisting that they had found the perfect place. It was presented as though it were a gift, but Helen felt the weight of betrayal settle, like lead in her chest. She refused at first, her voice shaking with indignation, but Sophia pressed harder, accusing her of being selfish, of not considering how much stress she was putting on her children. Mark added fuel, suggesting that the house was becoming a burden, implying that it would be better used if sold to a young family who could give it new life. The implication was unmistakable. Her home was no longer hers in their eyes. It was inventory. When Helen resisted further, the manipulation turned cruel. Sophia weaponized guilt, reminding her of the sacrifices she had made, raising her children, twisting those memories into accusations. After everything I've done for you, why can't you just cooperate? She hissed one evening. Mark leaned in his words like a knife. It's not your choice anymore. It's what's best. With her daughter and son-in-law united against her, Helen felt cornered, outnumbered, voiceless in her own life. The house that once felt like sanctuary now felt like a cage closing in on her. The betrayal was not only in their plan to steal her home, but in the shattering of trust, the inversion of love into coercion. Eventually, Helen was escorted, dragged into the nursing home. The room was sterile, stripped of familiarity, with walls the color of faded parchment and a window that looked out onto nothing but asphalt and a dying tree. She sat on the narrow bed, her heart collapsing under the weight of what had happened. For the first time in decades, she felt truly powerless. The lively, independent woman who had once commanded her own household, who had nurtured her family with tenderness and resilience, was reduced to a resident number on a clipboard. Her spirit cracked under the realization that her own flesh and blood had conspired to exile her from the only place she called home. At night, Helen lay awake, haunted by the thought that she was unwanted, discarded. The betrayal hollowed her from within, gnawing at her identity. She replayed conversations in her head, searching for where she had gone wrong. As a mother, what mistake she had made to deserve such cruelty. Every memory of Sophia's childhood, every Christmas morning and birthday cake became poisoned by the knowledge that the daughter she had cherished now saw her as an obstacle. Mark's shadow lingered in her mind, to a man who had never truly loved her as family, but who had now succeeded in dismantling her peace. The worst wound was not losing her house, though that cut deep enough. It was losing the illusion that family would always be her safe harbor. That illusion had sustained her through years of loneliness, through the grief of widowhood. But Sophia and Mark had shattered it with their greed. Sitting in that nursing home, Helen felt like a tree that had been uprooted and left to wither her roots, severed from the soil of memory and belonging. This betrayal was not simply about property. It was about power, about stripping an elderly woman of her dignity, her autonomy, her place in the world. And it left scars deeper than any financial loss could carve. Helen's collapse was not physical, but spiritual. It was the breaking of trust. The corrosion of love, in the brutal lesson that sometimes the greatest wounds are inflicted not by strangers, but by the hands of those we once called our own. The cruelty of betrayal does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, wrapped in silk and sugar. After weeks of pressuring Helen to accept the idea of leaving her home, Sophia and Mark shifted tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, they cloaked themselves in false affection, speaking in soft tones, smiling with counterfeit warmth, pretending to be allies, when in truth they were executioners with masks. It was psychological theater, a stage where Helen was forced into the role of a frail woman, stripped of her dignity, manipulated by the people she once trusted above all. Sophia began to appear at the house with small gestures, a bouquet of flowers, or a box of tea she claimed her mother would love. She would sit at the kitchen table, her tone saccharine, her hand patting Helen's arm in an exaggerated show of tenderness. "Mom, you know we care about you. We just want what's best," she would say, her voice sweet but hollow. Mark, sitting smugly in Edward's old leather chair, the chair no one else dared occupy when Edward was alive, would nod solemnly, chiming in with mock sympathy. It's hard to think about Mrs. Carter, but this is really for your comfort, for your safety. Helen wanted desperately to believe them, to cling to the illusion of family loyalty. But the falseness dripped from every gesture. She recognized the way Sophia's eyes darted toward the family photographs, as though calculating the value of frames instead of memories. She noticed the subtle glances Mark gave her whenever he spoke. His lips curved in a way that told her he was savoring the performance. Their kindness was an act rehearsed lines in a script where the ending was already written. Helen's signature on a set of legal documents that would strip her of everything. One evening, Sophia arrived with a glossy brochure for a retirement community. She opened it with a flourish, as though presenting a gift. Smiling too wide, she said, "Look, Mom, this place is wonderful. Private rooms, a garden, even a book club. You'll love it there. Imagine you won't be so lonely anymore." She spoke as though she were offering paradise. But Helen's heart constricted as she scanned the pictures, sterile hallways disguised with flowers, smiling actors posing as residents. The glossy pages mocked her. Every word Sophia uttered carried poison. Mark leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with authority. "It's not just about comfort. It's about planning ahead. You don't want to be a burden, do you? Think of how much stress you're putting on Sophia. We're only trying to help." His use of burden was calculated, a word chosen to carve guilt into Helen's chest. She flinched, feeling smaller under his gaze. That was exactly what he wanted. Then came the next phase, the introduction of a lawyer. One afternoon, Sophia and Mark showed up unannounced, leading a stranger in a sharp suit into Helen's living room, as though it were already their domain. "Mom, this is Mr. Benson," Sophia said, her tone falsely cheerful. "He's here to help us with the paperwork." The man spread documents across the coffee table, speaking quickly in legal jargon that made Helen's head spin. Phrases like transfer of rights and power of attorney blurred together. When Helen tried to protest, Sophia cut her off, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Don't worry, Mom. This is just so we can manage things for you. You won't have to worry about bills, taxes, or maintenance anymore." Mark placed a pen in her hand, his touch firm, his smile tight. "It's really in your best interest," he whispered through the undertone carried menace. Helen's hands trembled as she pulled back. Something deep inside screamed at her not to sign. "I don't understand all this," she muttered. "I need time." Her refusal cracked the mask. For a fleeting moment, Helen saw the frustration flash in Mark's eyes, the darkness beneath his charm. Days later, she discovered something even more sinister, a forged document. While sorting through her papers, Helen found a trial agreement tucked among her mail, bearing what looked like her signature. Panic surged through her. She had never signed such a paper. The realization hit like a thunderclap. Mark was willing to falsify her name, to commit outright fraud, to corner her with no escape. This wasn't concern. This was warfare. To intensify the intimidation, Mark made veiled threats. Standing in the yard where neighbors could overhear, he spoke just loudly enough. If Mom doesn't cooperate, maybe the court needs to decide whether she's competent to live alone. People have accidents all the time. The implication was chilling. He wanted the community to see Helen as unstable, to undermine her credibility, to make her look weak and incapable. Each night, Helen sat in her armchair, staring at the wall of family photos. There was Sophia in her graduation gown, smiling proudly. There she was on her wedding day, radiant in white. Memories that once brought joy, now twisted like knives. How could that little girl, the one Helen had nursed through fevers and sleepless nights, stand against her now with such cruelty? How could a daughter's hand, once soft with love, push her mother toward ruin? The performance of affection, the charade of concern, it was all a mask for greed. The flowers, the brochures, the gentle pats on her hand were nothing but props in a play designed to strip her of her autonomy. It was betrayal, wrapped in lace poison hidden in honey. And Helen, though wounded, began to see through the charade. Behind every smile was a calculation. Behind every weak care was a demand. Their love was counterfeit, and their ambition was lethal. In the small room, with light filtering weakly through the faded window, Helen sat silently on the old wooden chair. She felt as though the entire world was collapsing around her, leaving her without support, without refuge. The cold voices of her daughter and son-in-law still echoed in her mind, their accusations, their schemes to take everything from her, the looks that treated her as nothing but a burden. In that moment of despair, Helen's heart felt crushed, trembling on the fragile edge between surrender and survival. Yet like a river flowing backward through time, memories of a lifetime of sacrifice surged forth, pulling her back from the abyss of hopelessness. She remembered the early years, her frail hands trembling as she cradled her infant in the biting cold of winter, while her husband, the only man she ever trusted, worked long nights to support their family. Helen remembered meals watered down with tears of poverty, but never once did she allow her children to go without. She denied herself food, clothing, and comfort, saving every penny for school books, hoping her children could study and build a better future. When sickness came, she stayed awake through endless nights, her eyes hollowed with exhaustion. Yet all it took was the faintest smile returning to her child's face to make every sacrifice feel worthwhile. There were long years when her husband fell ill, and Helen bore the weight of both wife and mother, while also becoming the sole provider. She toiled endlessly in the factory, the thick dust of fabric clinging to her skin, her fingers hardened with calluses from the needle and thread. At night, she bent over a battered typewriter, taking on typing jobs to scrape together a little more income. Not once did she complain. Not once did she think of herself. Every ounce of strength, every dream she ever held was poured into her children. She wanted only one thing that they might live with, more than she had that they might live with dignity. And yet the cruelest twist of fate was that the very ones she had sacrificed everything for had now turned against her. The empty, indifferent eyes of her daughter cut into her like a blade. Helen felt herself fading into nothing, a useless shadow within the very house that had once overflowed with laughter. The loneliness was suffocating, so merciless that she nearly gave up. But then, so vividly, her husband's memory returned. She remembered that last evening, before he passed, his tired eyes still watching her with tenderness. He had gripped her hand tightly, whispering, "Helen, you must live strong. Don't ever let anyone trample you. I'll always be with you, even if I'm no longer here." Those words had carved themselves deep into her heart, though pain and hardship had nearly erased them. Now, in her darkest moment, they shone again, like a lantern in the night, scattering the shadows inside her. It was then, as she sorted through the old wooden cabinet, where he had always kept important papers, that Helen discovered a sealed envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and before her lay the secret will her husband had left behind. In it, he entrusted everything: the house, the savings, even investments she had never known existed to Helen alone. The handwriting was unsteady, tilted from the weakness of a man near death. But every word carried strength and certainty. "I leave it all to you, because you are worthy. Use it to protect yourself. Do not let anyone take advantage of your kindness again." Helen's throat tightened, tears welling up, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, cleansing her from the weight of betrayal. In every line of his will, she saw the man she had loved faithfully, the man who had truly understood and honored her sacrifices. The document was more than legal proof. It was living testimony to a love that could not be erased, to a trust that even death could not break. From that moment on, a new strength awakened inside Helen. It was as though life itself had been breathed back into her by the past, by love, by sacrifice, by endurance. She understood now that she was not alone, and that her years of giving had not been in vain. Her worth was not defined by the cold recognition of her daughter or the cruel indifference of her son-in-law. Her worth was carved in the life she had lived, in the resilience she had carried, and in the love that still surrounded her. Helen drew in a deep breath. The despair that had threatened to consume her slowly gave way to resolve. She knew this will would be her shield, her weapon, against those who plotted to strip her of everything. More importantly, it reignited within her a long-lost flame of dignity, empowering her to face them, to say no, to guard what was rightfully hers. She was no longer the mother who stepped back, who sacrificed herself until nothing remained. Now she was Helen, the woman who would rise from the ruins, who would protect herself, and who had finally learned to love herself, too. Helen sat quietly in her small living room, her eyes gazing through the window, though her mind was a storm of restless thoughts. In recent days, unease had seeped into every corner of her life, into her restless sleep, into every hollow smile from her daughter and son-in-law. They laughed, they asked polite questions, they pretended to care, but beneath their eyes, Helen could sense the tightening noose. She knew that if she remained silent, if she continued to play the role of the compliant mother, she would soon lose everything: her home, the savings her late husband had worked so hard to leave behind, and above all, her freedom in the last chapter of her life. She could not let that happen. And so she reached out to Rachel. Rachel was not a stranger. Years ago, she had been one of Helen's students in a short community history course. Helen remembered her vividly, a young woman with dark hair, tied neatly back eyes full of determination, and a confident smile. Now Rachel was an established attorney known for protecting the rights of the elderly against exploitation. When Helen called, her voice trembled, but Rachel listened patiently, never interrupting, never judging. "Come see me," Rachel said softly, "and we'll start with the truth. That single sentence lit a small fire inside Helen's chest. Their first meeting was in Rachel's office. The room was tidy shelves lined with legal files, but Rachel's presence made it feel safe rather than sterile. Helen poured out everything, the vague conversations, the times her son-in-law, Mark, had pushed documents toward her, her daughter Sophia's anxious insistence on a premium retirement home, even the way items in her own house were suddenly removed without her consent. Rachel took careful notes, occasionally pausing to confirm details. When Helen finished, silence filled the room. Rachel sighed, shook her head, and said, "This is a familiar pattern. They're trying to prove you're unfit to manage your estate so they can quietly transfer ownership. But the good news is we still have time." The first step was to verify all of Helen's assets. Rachel contacted the bank, the county clerk's office, and the land registry. Every document was collected, every red stamp reviewed. Helen sat beside her, staring at the dense legal text with mixed feelings, nervous, but also relieved. Everything was still intact. The house, a small plot of land in the suburbs, several stocks her husband had purchased years ago. They were undeniable proof of her rightful ownership. "As long as you hold firm," Rachel reassured her, "no one can force you out." But Rachel warned that Sophia and Mark would not give up easily. They might try to fabricate claims about Helen's memory decline. They could enlist a cooperative doctor or even forge paperwork to suggest she needed a guardian. Helen's heart clenched at the thought. She had been a teacher. Her mind was still sharp. She read the newspaper every morning. And yet, her own daughter could plot something so cruel. The pain was deep, but Helen knew tears would solve nothing. "We'll show them the truth," Rachel promised. "But you must be patient and strong." The next step was to gather evidence of coercion. Rachel advised Helen to keep quiet, to never confront them prematurely. She must let Sophia and Mark believe they still controlled her. Every time they pressed her to sign, Helen would stall, feigning hesitation, memorizing every word and gesture. Rachel arranged for a technician to install discreet recording devices in the living room and kitchen. "They will expose themselves," Rachel said firmly, "and when they do, we'll have proof." The following days felt like living on two battlefields. Outwardly, Helen still smiled, still allowed Mark to rummage through drawers, still listened as Sophia painted glowing pictures of the retirement community. But inwardly, she memorized, observed, and reported everything to Rachel at night. Helen felt like a spy in her own home. It was exhausting, surreal, but it stirred a strength she had nearly forgotten. She realized she was no longer just a mother to be controlled. She was a woman preparing to fight for her dignity. Rachel dug deeper, launching a quiet investigation. She scrutinized Sophia and Mark's bank records, uncovering suspicious withdrawals and shady loan contracts. A trail emerged. They were drowning in debt. And their plot to seize Helen's estate was not just greed, but desperation. The discovery cut Helen deeply, but it also steeled her resolve. She would not allow herself to be the solution to their financial ruin. Bit by bit, the puzzle came together. Assets confirmed, evidence accumulating, motives exposed. Helen and Rachel, two women from different generations, were now united on the same front. Each meeting grew sharper, more strategic, when to confront how to reveal the truth, how to protect Helen from any reckless outburst her daughter and son-in-law might attempt. Helen learned to speak less, to watch more, and above all, to trust the plan. In her heart, she knew Judgment Day would come. And this time, she would not be the one cornered. Helen would be the one to strike back, not out of vengeance, but out of a fierce will to defend her life and legacy. The plan was not just about keeping her assets. It was about reclaiming her self-worth, proving to the world and to herself that she still carried strength, dignity, and the right to live free. The morning that would change everything began with the sound of engines outside Helen Carter's house. She looked out her lace-trimmed window and saw the large, moving truck pulling into her driveway. Bold letters stamped across its side as if announcing her defeat. Behind it, a sleek black car rolled to a stop. Mark stepped out first, straightening his jacket with the smug precision of a man who believed victory was already his. Sophia followed her face, a mask of tension, but also resignation. Movers in gray uniforms approached the porch, their gloved hands ready to dismantle Helen's life. Inside, Helen's heart pounded, but she was calm, in a way she had not been in weeks. Every step leading to this moment, every sleepless night, every whispered conversation with Rachel, every recorded word had built toward today. She placed Edward's worn fountain pen on the coffee table, a silent symbol of the strength she carried with her, and opened the door. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," Mark said, with theatrical politeness. He walked straight into the living room, claiming Edward's old chair as if it belonged to him. "We'll try to make this transition quick. Sophia and I have already arranged everything. The movers will handle the furniture, and you'll be comfortably settled in Willow Pines by this evening." The movers hesitated, looking at Helen for permission. She remained silent for a moment, letting the tension thicken. Then, with a voice steady but edged with steel, she said, "No one is moving a single thing out of this house." Mark smirked. "Mrs. Carter, we've been over this. You're not fit to live alone anymore. We've got documents proving it, and the court will back us up. Save yourself the trouble." He pulled a folder from his briefcase, waving it as if it were the final word. Sophia sat on the edge of the sofa, avoiding her mother's eyes. Helen reached into her drawer and withdrew her own folder. She laid it gently on the table, sliding out documents Edward had prepared years ago. Deeds, stocks, and above all, the legal will naming her as the sole heir. "These," she said firmly, "are the real documents. This house, the apartment building, the shares, everything Edward left is mine. Legally, irrevocably. And I have the evidence to prove it." For the first time, Mark's confidence cracked. His smile faltered. He stood abruptly, towering over Helen. "Where did you get that?" His voice rose, laced with anger. "This is manipulation. You don't understand the law." He slammed his hand against the table, the pen rolling to the floor. The movers froze, unsure whether to proceed. Sophia gasped, torn between loyalty and disbelief. Then came the final twist of the knife. Sophia, her hands trembling, whispered, "Mark, stop." Her voice cracked. "She has proof. Maybe we should." But Mark silenced her with a glare. The confrontation escalated quickly into the courtroom a few weeks later. Judge Thomas Rivera presided, a man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. What Mark and Sophia did not know was that years ago, Helen had helped Rivera's mother, volunteering at a community fundraiser when his family was in crisis. Rivera recognized Helen immediately when she entered the courtroom, her posture proud, despite the weight of betrayal she carried. Mark's attorneys argued first, painting Helen as unstable, forgetful, a woman incapable of managing property. They waved around fabricated medical evaluations and questioned her competence. Mark played his role masterfully, even feigning concern, as he said, "All we want is what's best for her." But then Rachel stood, her voice calm yet commanding. She presented the recordings from Helen's home. Mark's threats, Sophia's coerced persuasion, their whispered plans about debts and the inheritance. She laid out financial records showing Mark's reckless spending and fraudulent signatures. Witnesses came forward, neighbors who had overheard shouting, who had seen Mark pressuring Helen on the porch. Piece by piece, the web unraveled. The courtroom shifted. Mark's confidence bled away under the weight of undeniable evidence. Sophia, pale and trembling, broke down under questioning, admitting that Mark had pressured her into the scheme and forged documents behind her back. Gasps rippled through the room. Finally, Judge Rivera leaned forward, his gavel heavy in hand. The evidence is overwhelming. Helen Carter is the rightful owner of all properties and investments listed. Mark Reynolds, you are found guilty of fraud, coercion, and attempted exploitation of an elder. You are hereby prohibited from contacting Mrs. Carter or attempting to claim her assets in any form. The gavel struck like thunder. The verdict was final. Mark stood frozen, his face drained of all arrogance. Sophia sobbed quietly, clutching her stomach her pregnancy revealed during testimony. Realizing the man she had chosen had led them both into disgrace. Helen sat tall, her hands clasped over Edward's fountain pen, the very same pen Mark had knocked to the floor weeks earlier. She did not smile, but her silence carried more weight than any outburst. She had not only defended her home, she had defended her dignity, her autonomy, her very right to exist on her own terms. As she walked out of the courtroom, Rachel, beside her reporters, shouted questions. Helen paused only once, turning back toward the cameras. With quiet strength, she said, "This was never about revenge. This was about justice, and about remembering that no one, not even family, has the right to take away your dignity." The flash of cameras followed her, but Helen kept walking, each step lighter than the one before. The battle was over. The truth had been exposed. And in that moment, she had reclaimed not just her home, but her life. Mark's carefully constructed world collapsed with a speed he could neither predict nor stop. For years, he had lived behind a polished mask, the successful businessman, the charming husband, the man who always seemed in control. Yet once the truth spilled into the open, once his manipulations, betrayals, and calculated lies could no longer be hidden, the unraveling was merciless. The first blow came in the form of reputation. In the circles where Mark once moved with ease, his name had carried weight. Colleagues, clients, even casual acquaintances had regarded him as reliable, perhaps even enviable. That aura evaporated overnight. People who once sought his approval now avoided eye contact. Boardrooms that once echoed with his voice became silent when he entered. His phone, which used to ring endlessly with new opportunities, now stayed cold and still. Reputation, he discovered, was not a possession, but a fragile loan from others once broken. It was almost impossible to reclaim. The financial consequences were no less brutal. With reputation came contracts, partnerships, and investors' trust. When that trust dissolved, the numbers in his accounts followed quickly behind. One by one, agreements were terminated, investments were withdrawn, and penalties piled up. Properties he had boasted about owning had to be sold in distress, each at a fraction of its value. The comfortable lifestyle that Mark had flaunted as proof of his success was revealed to be little more than a fragile facade propped up by others' belief in him. Without that belief, his empire crumbled like a house of cards. Debt collectors replaced bankers. Foreclosure notices replaced congratulatory letters. The man who once lectured others about financial discipline now found himself calculating whether he could afford groceries for the week. There was a bitter irony in the reversal. The hunter of opportunities had become their prey. Losing his job was perhaps the most public humiliation of all. Mark had built his identity around his position. It was not just employment. It was the stage on which he performed his brilliance, where he felt admired and indispensable. Yet scandals are poison in professional environments, and no employer would keep a man whose presence attracted only suspicion and mockery. The dismissal was swift, and though couched in formal corporate language, everyone knew the real reason. To Mark, it felt like being stripped naked in front of an audience that once applauded him. There was no graceful exit, no farewell party. Just silence followed by the hollow sound of a door closing behind him. The man who used to give orders now faced the humiliation of rejection letters, each one more devastating than the last. If the destruction of his career and finances was brutal, the collapse of his marriage was catastrophic. Sophia, his wife, had stood by his side for years, often blind to the subtle inconsistencies in his stories. The unexplained absences, the strange emotional distance. She had believed in the version of Mark he projected, the hard-working husband, the loyal partner, the man striving for their shared future. When the truth was finally laid bare, it was not just betrayal. She felt it was shock at the depth of her own misjudgment. She stared at him and realized she had not been married to the man she thought she knew, but to an illusion carefully crafted to keep her compliant. The sense of violation went beyond infidelity or financial dishonesty. It reached into the very core of her identity as a wife. To love someone is to build a life together on trust, and now that foundation had been blown apart. She felt not only grief, but shame, as if her loyalty had been a form of blindness others could see. But she could not. Sophia's shock manifested in silence at first. She watched the pieces of her world collapse and could barely speak. When she finally found her voice, it was not the voice of anger, but of clarity. She no longer pleaded, no longer asked for explanations. She simply looked at Mark with eyes that carried no recognition, as though he were a stranger who had wandered into her life under false pretenses. For Mark, that silence was sharper than any accusation. It told him that the bond he had taken for granted was gone, perhaps forever. Sophia began to reclaim her independence, quietly, separating her finances, moving her belongings, and preparing her own escape. Her withdrawal was a mirror held up to his downfall, where once she had looked at him with admiration, now she looked through him as if he did not exist. The psychological consequences cut deeper than the material ones. Mark had always thrived on control, controlling narratives, people's perceptions, and even his wife's trust. With every lie exposed, the control evaporated. He discovered the terrifying truth that power built on deception is unsustainable. In its place came isolation. Friends distanced themselves, colleagues avoided him, neighbors whispered. He walked into familiar places and felt like an intruder. Pride, once his armor, became his prison, preventing him from asking for help, even when he desperately needed it. Each day stretched into a grim reminder of what he had lost. Nights were worse, filled with restless thoughts and a haunting awareness of Sophia's absence beside him. In the end, Mark was left with nothing but the echo of his own choices. His name was tarnished, his wealth dissolved, his career ended, and his marriage shattered. Sophia, though devastated, at least carried the strength of self-respect regained. Mark carried only regret and the knowledge that his downfall was not caused by bad luck or enemies, but by his own arrogance. The consequences were not a punishment imposed by others. They were the natural harvest of seeds he had sown for years. And in that realization lay the most painful truth of all. He had not only destroyed the trust of those who believed in him, he had destroyed himself. When the storm finally broke inside their household, Sophia understood that there was no way forward if she remained tethered to Mark. For years, she had lived under the shadow of his arrogance and schemes, enabling patterns of betrayal and self-destruction, without fully realizing how deeply she had become complicit. Leaving him was not a single dramatic moment of slammed doors and shouting. It was a slow, quiet decision that ripened inside her over weeks of reflection. She packed what little she truly owned, walked away from the grand but hollow home they had built on lies, and chose exile over further humiliation. In that silence, she felt both the sting of loss and the first breath of freedom. The departure did not make Sophia a saint. She carried guilt for her own blindness, for the years she ignored the damage inflicted on others, most painfully on Helen. Helen had been more than a rival. She had been the collateral victim of choices that Sophia had allowed to unfold. The betrayal that destroyed Helen's peace was not only Mark's crime. Sophia had watched it happen, bound by fear, by convenience, by a need for validation that had long since corroded her dignity. Once separated from Mark, she could no longer escape the realization she owed a debt that words alone could never repay. Sophia's first attempts at rebuilding were clumsy. She tried to start a business, poured her savings into ventures that collapsed, and drifted between small towns in search of a place where no one recognized her name. The loneliness was punishing, yet necessary. Each failure stripped away another layer of the illusion that she could simply reinvent herself without confronting the past. Slowly, she learned humility. She lived simply, read voraciously, and worked part-time jobs that once would have embarrassed her. It was not punishment, it was education. In humility, she began to understand the true value of dignity and integrity. News of Helen reached her unexpectedly through a local paper that ran a feature about the foundation for victims of family betrayal. Helen, the very woman once shattered by deceit, had transformed her pain into a mission. The article described how the foundation funded legal aid, offered counseling, and created safe spaces for seniors manipulated by those they trusted most. Sophia read the words over and over, struck by the irony. The woman she had once wronged was now a public symbol of resilience. That night, Sophia could not sleep. The thought of reaching out directly to Helen felt impossible, an intrusion, perhaps even an insult. But she realized she could begin quietly, indirectly, by supporting the very cause Helen had built. Redemption, she decided, did not require proximity. It required action. Sophia started small. She sent anonymous donations, each modest compared to the wealth she once flaunted, but sincere, drawn from her own earned income. Later, she offered to volunteer at local partner shelters under a pseudonym, filing paperwork, answering phones, cleaning floors, work that nobody applauded, work that forced her to listen rather than speak. Each task became a silent prayer for forgiveness. Gradually, her presence was noticed by coordinators who admired her reliability. She never announced her past, never used Helen's name as an entry point. Instead, she focused on service. And though Helen remained unaware of who was working behind the scenes in distant branches of her foundation, Sophia knew. That knowledge alone gave her strength. She was no longer a spectator to harm. She was a contributor to healing. In time, Sophia's involvement deepened. She developed a program that matched retired teachers with victims of financial abuse, helping them learn basic digital literacy so they could manage their own accounts and recognize fraud. It was a simple idea born from her own belated education after leaving Mark. The program drew attention at a national conference hosted by Helen's Foundation, though Sophia attended anonymously, sitting quietly in the back row. She listened as Helen spoke with authority and grace, describing stories of survival urging society to stop confusing silence with consent. Every sentence felt like it was directed at Sophia, a reminder of the years she had stayed silent beside Mark. Tears blurred her vision, but she stayed until the end, clapping softly unseen among the crowd. Through these indirect acts, Sophia did not erase the past, but she reshaped her future. She learned that reconciliation is not always a handshake or a dramatic reunion. Sometimes it is invisible, a series of choices that restore balance to the world, one action at a time. She never demanded recognition, never wrote a letter begging Helen for absolution. Instead, she carried her remorse as fuel, converting it into service that reached people she would never meet. Her life, once defined by complicity, began to carry a quieter form of nobility. She found peace, not in being forgiven, but in knowing she had ceased to harm and had begun to heal. Friends who knew nothing of her history admired her dedication, calling her selfless. She never corrected them. The truth was that every hour she gave to the foundation was in her heart a confession. Years later, when she walked past a shelter painted with the foundation's emblem, she paused and smiled faintly. She did not step inside. She did not need to. Her journey had never been about reclaiming a relationship with Helen. It had been about reclaiming her own soul. In leaving Mark, in living humbly, and in channeling her guilt into service, Sophia discovered a form of reconciliation that transcended apology. She had become, in her own imperfect way, a part of Helen's legacy. Years slipped by, not in silence, but in the steady rhythm of renewal. Helen Carter, once cornered, betrayed, and left to believe she was powerless, now found her life woven with new meaning. Her garden bloomed again, not just with African violets, but with the laughter of Grace, her granddaughter. The little girl became a beacon, a living reminder that even after storms of betrayal, love could take root again in unexpected soil. Helen didn't spend her days counting losses anymore. Instead, she measured her time in stories told to Grace, in hands held at community centers, in the lives touched through the Home and Dignity Foundation. Every time she stood before an audience of women who had been silenced, manipulated, or stripped of their worth, she carried her scars openly, not as shame, but as proof. Proof that survival wasn't the end of the story. Justice, when paired with dignity, could transform the ashes of betrayal into the foundation for something lasting. At community events, Helen often spoke of the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge, she explained, feeds the fire of anger until it consumes you. But justice, that's different. Justice restores balance, reclaims dignity, and ensures that no one can write you out of your own story. It doesn't erase the pain, but it prevents the pain from defining you. And in the eyes of her audience, whether it was a room of seniors, a courtroom survivor, or her granddaughter hanging on to every word, Helen could see that message settling deep, sparking something unshakable. Grace, now old enough to understand pieces of the truth, often asked her grandmother to tell the fairy tale version of what happened. Helen would smile, weaving a story of a brave grandmother who stood up against a greedy dragon, not with a sword, but with wisdom, courage, and an unbreakable belief in herself. And as Grace clapped her hands at the happy ending, Helen knew she was passing on the most important inheritance of all, the belief that dignity is worth fighting for. And so the story leaves us here with a truth Helen carved into her legacy. Some battles are worth fighting, not out of vengeance, but because justice is the shield that guards our humanity. Now, if this story touched you, if you believe dignity matters as much as justice, don't just keep it to yourself. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your perspective, or tell us about the battles you've seen fought in silence. Save this video if you want to return to Helen's journey, and hit subscribe so you'll never miss the next story that reminds us of the power within. Because sometimes the right story at the right time can be the spark someone else desperately needs.